Kids screaming. You gotta get Alistair. Hi, Alistair. Alistair, we're making a movie.
Daddy, I think Bob and Cherry came also too.
Yeah, they're here. Go say hi. Hi, Greg with Butter Suspension, back again with another wonderful video. Today, I'm going to rebuild a RockShox Reverb. This is specifically going to be more of a how I do rather than a how-to. But if you are curious as to what goes into one of these things and how to rebuild them, this is how I do it. I want to make one specific comment too. There's a lot of BS out there about reverbs, and there's a lot of hate for them, and I get it. They have had their issues, but I will also say there's somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million reverbs out in the market. There may be more at this point. So you kind of have to expect that with 1 million of anything, some things are going to go wrong. Also, one of my favorite things about the reverb, I can rebuild these all day long, over and over and over again, every single time. As long as I can get parts, I can rebuild it. And every single one that I have rebuilt, none of them have come back. So, follow me. We're going to tear this thing apart and put it back together and watch it work. Alright, let's rebuild this reverb. There is a first assumption here. One, we've removed the seat, and two, we've already removed the hose. There's some specific tools that I have. You don't need every single one of these tools to do this job, but man, oh man, it sure does make life easier. One you're gonna have to have is a Reverb IFP depth setting tool. These come in a couple different versions. There are newer versions. I've used this one so many times I just know how to use this one the fastest. Reverb wrench, this fits up on that collar, and then this fits on an internal part that we'll show in a little bit. Shaft clamps for seat posts, 30.9, 31.6. You don't need these. You can use something in a vise like a soft jaw, but these grip so well and they don't ever mess with the surface. A Torx T10 to when you go to do the bleed. And then this is a really fancy RockShox Reverb air cap tool, but it also works on the newer posts to set or reset the vent valve. This one doesn't have vent valve, so we won't be using it for that, but I just use this because it's already set up to do the air cap. It's pretty slick. Other than that, you'll need some special grease. You can either use the RockShox seal grease or you can use the Slick Honey. Lots of paper towels to clean stuff up. I use lots of Q-tips. I use thousands of Q-tips a day. It's crazy. And other than that, that should be your basic stuff. You also need oil, sorry. Reverb oil. Alright, let's party. These posts are incredibly strong, but you don't have to go nuts clamping them. I'm going to take this off. This is a 4mm Allen. Set that aside. Set this one aside. Keep in mind that these have an arrow to show direction. You can put them on backwards, but hey, maybe don't put them on backwards. And there's 2 arrows. Oh, and this one was on halfway backwards. Look at that. So yeah, both arrows should point the same direction. Wipe off all the schmoo. This is a 9mm socket. If you don't have this fancy RockShox one, you can just use a 9mm socket. And it's literally just a valve cap. Unthread this. I keep the cap in there because that way I know where it is. Most important part of this whole rebuild, defuse the bomb. These are generally set at 250 psi, and if you do not defuse the 250 psi and you let oil out, it goes everywhere. Like everywhere it can. I just use like something blunt. You don't want sharp because it'll scratch. You can see this one has a little bit of squish. It's always good to do a little test just to make sure, yep, okay, this needs a rebuild. There shouldn't be any squish at all on these. And I put a little rag right here. Make sure it's all out. And then you're gonna remove the collar. Set this aside. In the bottom here, we have a circlip. Notice I have my finger on top of this, that way it doesn't fly away when it comes out. Set that aside. At this point, the post will pull up from the bottom. Now we're going to clamp on this shaft. You really want to make sure this is clean. This is a sealing surface, and so this keeps oil and air, depending on what type of post you have. If it's a stealth or non-stealth, sometimes these do different jobs. But no matter what, this is a sealing surface. So any scratches on here totally degrades performance. If you get really bad scratches, it lets oil leak, and then the post eventually just fails. So this is a 10mm shaft. So I'm going to take my 10mm shaft clamps. Clamp this here. Notice I'm not going crazy, just good amount right there. And we're going to grab 2 different wrenches. One is going to hold this collar, and the other one is going to open the collar. The thing is, these can both turn at the same time, so you want to hold the big one in place while you open this one. Now, second possibility for an exploding bomb here. On these posts, when you start to get the squish, air moves from the air chamber into the oil chamber. So even a little bit of squish, at some point, this is going to be also a pressurized chamber. It won't be quite as pressurized as 250 psi, but you want to be careful here when you take this out, because it's going to want to shoot out. So what I do on this, when I'm about to take this apart, you could just unthread it and let it go, but even a little bit of oil in the face just gets old. So I take a plastic bag and I hold onto that main collar right here, and I slowly unthread this. Maybe we'll get a little excitement today. Okay, and instantly I put my finger right there, because I still don't want this thing to pop out. Grab a set of pliers. Down inside here is a little thing you can grab. Hear that little, yep, that was a little bit of air pressure that was left in there. So, take off the fitting. Oh, it's exciting. It's exciting. Look at it. It's having a party. So that's the air inside the oil trying to get out, trying to bubble out. Throw away the plastic bag. Grab a rag. So this is our poppet. This is basically the switch internally that opens and closes. So when you push the button, this thing gets out of the way and allows the oil to move so the post can go down. You let off the button, it holds the oil in place, and then you push the button again, you get up off the seat, the air pushes the post back up, and then moves everything back to where it should be. I always, whenever I'm taking these things apart, I just clean everything up. Inspect for scratches. The first generations of these posts had some silver parts, and you couldn't really see some of the scratches, and they changed them over time so that everything internally was black anodized. And the nice thing about black anodized is you can instantly see any scratches or any damage. It just pops right away. So generally speaking, these internally, nothing happens, so they don't get scratched up. At least they shouldn't be. But take that out, set it aside. Normally I set this fitting aside, but we're gonna toss this one because it's garbage. That is the part that we're replacing. Unthread the lower portion here. Check it, looks good. Set it aside. This is the snap ring that goes in the bottom. Just clean it, set it aside. You always want to check these for rust. Sometimes first generations of this new snap ring, they will corrode so bad that the post just falls apart. Bit of a design flaw, but they are replaceable, and they come in a rebuild kit when you get the correct rebuild kit for these. So this one's in good shape, so we're not going to replace it. I have a pretty fancy vise. It's very parallel. It's very strong, but it also has a lot of control. And so I don't use soft jaws. I just have smooth jaws on my vise. But I clamp the head directly in the vise. If you have a crappy vise or a serrated vise, you can see the teeth back here are serrated. I flipped them over. You'll want to use soft jaws for this, just to protect the post parts. Make sure the head slides down. As you take this off, slowly, there are brass keys. They're going to want to fall out. Take these off. And then set these aside as well. We're not going to reuse these, but we do want to hang on to them because there are different size keys that go inside here. Let's see if we can see this, but you can see on this there are 3 little grooves in here, so that's a number 3 key. So when I go to my little kit full of parts, I'm going to go grab another set of number 3 keys. Down inside there is a foam ring which keeps dust out, and there's also a bottom out ring. So that's those 2. Technically you could reuse these, but hey, anytime you're inside here you might as well replace everything. Set those aside. Set the post right there. Now you see here, this is the lower bushing. The upper bushing is inside this seal head right here. You can also see there's like brass schmutz on here because the keys are made of brass. They are designed to wear, and that's also why you replace them. This bushing is aluminum, and it's pretty soft, so I just pry it away. That's garbage. And now this is the inner seal head. You can see there's a set of wrench flats here. If you've got the RockShox tool, it's already built into that end. Also, it's a 23mm. So this is technically possibly the 3rd tiny bomb. There could still be a little bit of air built up in here, so I unthreaded a couple, and then I will take this rag, put a little bit up here. Almost never happens, but I always cover this up as I'm unthreading it in case it wants to go boom again. It shouldn't, but they have. The reason why I do this every time, I just like to make sure I don't get sprayed in the face. That's what she said. Okay. Drip, drip, like that. Set it aside. These are going to be pretty clean inside here. There are some times when I get a post that's like 7 years old, never been rebuilt. The oil in there is pretty dirty. At this point, you can slide the seal head off. You need a tank to drain stuff. I have a sink built up. You want to let all the old oil out. Okay. So down inside here is an inner IFP tube and also an IFP, which is your internal floating piston. The RockShox instructions have this. The way that they tell you to do it is you take the IFP tube out and then you stick a bunch of zip ties down in, and then you pull out the zip ties. That's totally a fine way to do it. I personally don't do it that way because it gets a bunch of zip ties oily, and zip ties cost money. I get it, but the way that I do it, and other people have done it too, is you hook the pump up, and then clamp it in the vise, and then you take yet another plastic bag, put your finger against the IFP tube, and you're going to pressurize the system, and it should go thump, because what you're doing right now is pressurizing between the seal head, sorry, the valve, and then you're pushing the IFP internally up, and we'll see what the IFP is when we pull it out. But if you pressurize it slowly, it should slowly work its way up and then release pressure when it gets right here. That's why I put the plastic bag over here, because I could just put my finger in here, but again, it sprays oil everywhere. It gets messy. There we go. So that basically pushed it up until it released. I still keep the bag on because it wants to keep going. So now you can see the purple part right here. That is the IFP, the internal floating piston. This is both the cause and cure of all life's reverb problems. So this is the IFP tube. That's the old IFP. We're going to replace this. This is the 3rd generation IFP. They are on to the 4th generation. The 1st generation was metal with O-rings, which was, it would tend to rock a little bit, and it would let air bypass, and then you'd get the squish. And then the 2nd gen was plastic, same design. The idea was that the plastic wouldn't score the inside if it got crooked, but it still would let air pass. 3rd generation is this purple one, which is it's just a type of rubber. But this one was a little stiff. They made it stiff so that it wouldn't let air bypass, but it also would tend to kind of squeak when you put them in until they broke in a little bit. And then 4th generation is the gray one, which is the same shape and design as this, but it's just a little bit softer durometer, and so it doesn't squeak, but it still does the job. These also, they have a much longer service life overall, so you can rebuild them and you get to have way more time between rebuilds before the air starts to bleed over into the oil. So set that aside, clean off your IFP tube. Same thing, you're looking for scratches. Looks pretty good, nothing here. I will take a small piece of paper towel and a wooden stick, not metal. Do not use any metal when you're doing this. This wood cannot scratch this thing. And I'll spray a little alcohol on the inside. Push this little piece of paper. This is just so that you know that it's perfectly clean on the inside before you put it back together. Use my wooden dowel. Beep. Push out the old schmoo. Clean the outside. Set that aside. Remove the pump. Any extra, there shouldn't be much at this point. There might be 1 or 2 drops, but yep, it's pretty much all gone. Give this a nice clean. And then I put this right back because we are going to put it back together from this point. Before we put this back together, I'm going to show you just a couple things as far as parts. So RockShox sells complete seal kits for these. There's a bunch of different versions of this because there's a bunch of different versions of the post. I want to make sure this is clean, so just give it a spray. I'm just using rubbing alcohol on this. Same thing on this. When you push this through, you don't use metal. You always want to make sure and use plastic or a wood dowel. I have that wood piece. I also have this dowel. Or this plastic PVC tube. Kind of gross. Set that aside. And then this is the main seal head. This one actually looks like it's in pretty good shape. It's pretty clean. I will totally reuse this and everything that's inside here, but I will clean it out. This is where I go bonkers with my Q-tips. I'm going to pack this with the RockShox dynamic grease. You don't need to go nuts, but you are making sure that the lip wiper has a bunch of grease in there. You can see it's all green. And then I'll also paint the bushing itself. And then I will load this onto the upper shaft. You can see I'm giving it a lot of English here because I don't want anything to fold over. It should just slide right down. Clean that off. Next up is the IFP tube, and the new IFP tube has holes at one end and nothing at the other. The holes will go down here. If you do this wrong, the post won't work. Same thing with this, lots of the green dynamic seal grease, and I'll use a little metal poker, but again, this is not sharp, this is just like an applicator. I'll just schmoo it up on the inside. Because one side of this is going to be against oil, they have you pack the whole thing so that no bubbles are hanging out. And again, a little English. I'll just get it started. You want it past the holes. On the RockShox site, they're very specific about every single step of this, which is good. If you're going to do this first time, follow the directions. You know, really see what they do. Once you've done 100 of these, all you do is just go through the motions. You just, repeat, repeat, repeat. Because these are always the same. There's different measurements, but the procedure is always the same. So take a bunch more of this grease, smear it everywhere, and then I am loading this gland here. So you can see there's room there for oil or grease, but also for air. So you don't want air on the oil side, so I pack this so there's nowhere for it to go. Same thing on this side. And then smear the outside just for lubrication, and also this is what helps keep it quiet. Now you get out your IFP tool. So on the old tool, it said Stealth All. Well, that was for the generation post before this. And you can see here, because they didn't have the secondary tool on my tool, I scratched in B1. So this generation here with the RockShox is a generation B1. And then a little further up there's a C1, because they changed it again for the C1 Stealth. And so I just use these as my markings. So I'll drop this in. Now this end is going to engage inside like a stub down on the bottom that has an O-ring on it. But you want to get the IFP in first before you engage that stub. You'll see what I'm talking about here. So I just kind of push this in. This is where you have to be very patient and slow. So I'm gonna just, there's like a secondary dimension in here. I just want to get it past that. So this is not the final setting of the IFP, but I want to get this lined up and on that stub. Sometimes you have to look down inside. You'll be able to see which way it wants to go. There we go. And it should make a thunk. It'll click into that spot. So now that the IFP tube is in the right spot, we got to get the IFP itself in the right spot. So again, gold RockShox, that's a B1. You got to go slow, take your time, because if you push this too far, you'll have to pop that thing out and redo it. So I'm just going real slow, take my time, take that out. So that's now set. Put that tool away. You're going to want to fill this up with reverb oil. And you'll see it kind of, and you're going to fill the inside and the outside. We're just going to let that sit. Sometimes bubbles pop up. You can take a plastic screwdriver, give it a tap. But we're just going to let it do its job. Now, to rebuild the seal head, I'm going to come around on this side. So this is the internal seal head, and this is the internal piston, if you will. Wipe it all off. Again, double check. Black anodized for any scratches. This looks like it's in good shape. We're going to remove this O-ring. You can use a pick to remove an O-ring. You should not use a pick to remove an O-ring. Anytime you can avoid using a sharp metal object to get an O-ring off, you're going to save yourself a lot of heartache, because if you slip this at all and scratch the anodizing in this, that's a sealing surface, and this will no longer seal properly. So what you want to do is squeeze it and roll it off. Boom, no tools necessary. This is a plastic backup ring. You want to make sure that stays in that position right there. Put a little shmoo in here. Roll this over into place. Give it a good coat. Set that aside. Same thing here. We got more O-rings that you want to take off without tools. There are 2 O-rings on the outside of the seal head. They are different diameters and they are also very different durometers. One is actually a sealing O-ring. That's this one. And the other is a super hard. It's literally just a spring. And it sits inside this bushing to make sure to give it outward pressure. Clean this all up. Make it look pretty. Okay, now that I've given you the spiel on not using sharp things, this is the one spot where you have to use a sharp thing because we can't get down inside to replace this. In the seal kit, the RockShox full seal kit, you just get a whole seal head like this. So if you want to make sure that you really don't scratch anything, then you just replace this seal head. But I like to save money and make it as economical as possible to rebuild this post for my customers, so I will replace this internal seal head. It's a U-cup seal. U-cup literally means the cross section of it is the shape of a U, so oil wants to go this way. It just keeps all the oil in. So you gotta be real careful here. What I'm gonna do is actually stab the seal itself. So I will destroy it in the process, but I will protect the gland as I do it. So you can see this pop out, boom. So you can see how I've stabbed it. It's staying right there. So we set these buddies aside. Clean it out. If you're going to clean it out with Q-tips, be careful not to leave any fuzz, because fuzz will cause problems. Get my little green applicator. Put some shmoo in here. I preload it because it makes it slippery and easier. Now, this is a directional U-cup seal. If you put it in backwards, it won't work. That's one nice thing about just replacing the seal head is you don't have to worry about that. RockShox has done the work for you. But pop that in, and I will use this little tool to kind of pry it into place, and I'll hold it in place as I push this down. This takes a little practice. It's a pretty stiff seal, and so it wants to fight you. Come on, get in there, buddy. Boom. And just to reiterate, this is pointy but not sharp at all, so it really lets me kind of get in there, but I don't have to worry about damaging anything. Okay, fresh O-ring out here, fresh O-ring in here. I put the bushing on after I get this all installed. This is also directional, so you can put this on backwards, but you really wouldn't be able to put the post back together. A little more grease there. All right. So to keep a bunch of oil from spilling everywhere, I'll take this and wrap it around just below the top of that. And I'll take this and just slowly work it in. Oil's gonna spill no matter what. This just keeps it from getting all over the floor. And I'm just slowly wiggling it in. You're gonna get a little tick. And then you just always wanna thread it in by hand to make sure you don't cross thread. Wipe off the excess. And once I know that this is started properly, I could just send it home. Careful not to scratch. torque wrench. These go to 250 inch-pounds. Boop. So this bushing, you can see when I took the thing apart, I can just tear it apart with my hands. So you got to be kind of careful here, but you just want to pry it over so that it sits kind of on that groove. It's a little spring-loaded. We're gonna get to that when we put the post on. The lower post, sorry. Grease the inside. You don't need a ton, but you want it pretty liberal because it's gonna push up and down. Now, I always set it up so that the back of the seat post is facing me in the vise, and then when I put this all together, all these markings, which are also the back of the post, they're gonna end up lining up because the keys in here line up a certain way to make all the logos look cool. Technically speaking, you can put this on one of three ways, and it doesn't affect performance. It just looks better when it's how it was when you took it apart. When you're putting this together, you kind of want to squeeze this bushing, and then I kind of just give it like a circular motion. And I've stopped just before I get to the slots for the keys, because now we're going to put the keys in place. More grease. Keys will just stick there. And these are again the number 3 keys, matching what I pulled out. And then make sure they're all greased up. And I will hold all 3 as I rotate this down. If you just push it down without holding them, they'll just shoot out of their spots. So when I'm looking for those keyways internally too, slide that down. Slide this up. This doesn't have to be super tight. We're going to tighten it towards the end, but you just want it on there. This comes down. That's your bottom out O-ring and your keep out schmoo foam ring. Alright. And we take our 10mm clamps. This doesn't need to be crazy tight. There is a torque setting for it. Please go to the RockShox file and find the torque setting. It's a cop-out, but it's not an issue. Okay, now we need to fill the internal part of the post for where the poppet sits. This one is a 340mm post. So then I go to my little chart, 240, 125, so that's 166. Sorry, this is one more tool that you need. It is a oil depth gauge. You can get these at a motorcycle shop. They make a RockShox version. But this basically sets how deep the oil goes when you go to place this inside. It has to be very specific because of how that poppet actuates inside the post. So what did I say, 166? 140, 150, 160, there we go. More reverb oil. You don't need to overfill this. You just get it in there. Come on, buddy. So this sits right there. That is 166mm down inside. You gotta pull this until all the juice is out. And just to make sure, I do it twice. Good. A little bit of grease on this. And you want to push that down in. So this is basically the wall between your hose and your post. And as I said in a previous video, this is why you can't just bleed the post to fix a sagging dropper, because there is no talking between the oil inside the post and the oil inside the hose. You can bleed this 100 times, and this poppet valve is the wall between the two. Nothing ever exchanges between the two. So that's why when people say just bleed it, they're wrong. Anytime you have the squish in a reverb, you have to do a rebuild. You don't necessarily have to use all new parts. If it's brand new, basically like this one's in great shape, I technically could have rebuilt it without replacing any of the parts, because if you do a couple things to these posts, like if you lift up on them when they're down and you get air over into the oil side, nothing is broken, nothing is degraded. It just sucks that air got past, and you have to do a rebuild. But like I said, you don't need to replace the parts. That being said, you're in there, you might as well replace the parts and make sure everything's brand new and good to go. So clamp this buddy on. Alright. So I'm holding this lower part still, because if I turn this, it'll turn on the shaft, and this is already tight on the shaft. I don't want it to move anymore. Again, there is a torque setting for this. Basically, it doesn't have to go anywhere. Okay, now you slide this up, get our circlip, make sure that's in there. Get this tool again. This is also 250 inch-pounds. Come on. Same thing, 90 degrees to the tool. Pretty tight. That stays there. I'm going to pump this up to 250 psi. Go. Okay, at this point, other than the bleed, this post is rebuilt. There's a way to test without having to hook up the hose and do a bleed and all that stuff. It's nice to test this without the hose so that you don't find out after hooking up a hose and bleeding that you did something wrong. So the test is basically this. If you can push on it, it shouldn't move at all. So that's dead solid. And then when you push the button on your hose, you're literally pushing that poppet valve open. So down inside here is a 2mm hole, 2.5, whatever. I'm going to take an Allen wrench, and I'm just going to stick it up through the hole and basically activate the poppet as I push on this. So what I'm doing is I'm opening the valve, I push down. If I take it out, it stays down. If I push this in again, boom, pops up. Solid, doesn't move, boom. Test, it works. It's kind of a slick little thing because it's really nice to be able to just focus on the post. You don't have to worry about your bleed. You know, you just get that done before you move on. So, very important, put your little valve cap back on. This keeps dirt and water out of the post. Doesn't have to be crazy tight. And then the arrows point forward, both of them. And this is just to keep it all together. All right. Now we'll hook up the hose and do a bleed.